I would like to begin saying that, of course, we have come to understand that the AI that we normally use does not work for us, for everyone, and that we also know that technology discriminates against us in various ways. So I think that we have reached a moment where we are witnessing that many stakeholders do want to correct these problems, structural problems that AI is facing. But sometimes people, well, usually in many places, in many forums, people ask, well, how? There are technical solutions, there are legal solutions, and you all know about these solutions. But I think, of course, there are no single solutions. And what we do want to change with these projects is the root causes of structural asymmetries. And also, as you said, we are not trying to develop technologies because we think that technologies themselves are the purpose. We think that technologies are related and connected to our present and the future that we want to inhabit. So you touched a lot of things, and I would like to begin asking you a couple of questions. You were saying at the beginning that you are not the usual suspect for this kind of projects because you are a digital rights organization and you embraced this challenge of thinking and also, as you said, trying to see how knowledge is transferred, because that also helps us. And you also mentioned the way that we are approaching these topics, maybe from a regulation aspect or a technical aspect, but usually we don't have funding for knowledge building, like knowledge transferring, knowledge building. What do you envision for our region? What are the things that we need to change? You mentioned some things, but this is, again, this is not a single problem. We are not going to have a solution if we only address one aspect. How do you envision this feminist AI future for our region?
I guess we will only be able to build a feminist AI future for a region if we are able, one, to make these initiatives viable. So when I say Derechos Digitales is not the usual suspect for this type of initiative, is because we were mainly focused on policy analysis in our history. Most of our 18 years of history has been dedicated to policy analysis and policy advocacy. And experience shows us that that's not enough. If we go to dialogues with policymakers, and most of these initiatives are invisible to them, there are other forms of building systems, there are other logics, there are other methodologies that are being put into practice right now, in this very moment, in this very region, by several groups usually with small amounts of money, and they are being able to advance immense things. And that's invisible inside countries, that's invisible at the regional level, and that's invisible at the global level also. So one of the main drivers for us to get very much involved in these type of conversations is to think about how do we put ourselves at service to document these practices, but at the same time, how do we try to bridge this gap in terms of knowledge? Because we are not we don't necessarily believe that these feminist principles can be mainstreamed, and that's why we decided not to develop a guide that someone could say, I'm following this and now I can have the label of feminist AI into my system. So because that's unreal to think, but we need to create spaces for these initiatives to continue to exist and for these initiatives to flourish. And it is my impression that that's not into the priorities of policymakers right now. When we discuss tech policies and when we discuss human rights and technology, we really want to protect people from abuses. And some of the responses that we can reach trying to protect them might have impacts into smaller initiatives that are trying to develop other types of things. And how we build protections for our people, and at the same time we build protections for our forms of developed technology is a key question that I don't know if it's being discussed. I will bring some examples on how imaginaries from policymakers and imaginaries on technology is so colonized. And I'm sure you know several of other examples. In Brazil, we had a very vibrant discussions for the data protection bill for almost 1 decade, the past decade, until it was finally approved and developed. And at the last minute, the innovation legislator, the innovation leaders decided to put one criteria that would make more flexible the data protection safeguards or in the data protection norms to startups. And that could be a very interesting idea if you want to develop a national industry, a national tech industry, etc. However, we know that when it comes to data protection, several startups reproduce the same extractivist logics of big tech, or even worse than those. And in several cases, they have even less protections than big tech is able to put into their own technologies because they have less resources. They want to advance profits very quickly and not necessarily putting in place all the safeguards and all the standards that should be considered to avoid data breaches or several other forms of abuses. So if we think this type of mechanism connected to concrete principles and concrete methodologies that at the same time want to advance localized, territorialized technology connected to communities, and at the same time allow this industry to flourish, respecting human rights, we need to find the mechanisms, even the legal mechanisms that protect this particular type of local development and not other forms. And I'm using the language of this type of discussions, but in the sense, what we are trying to think about and to reflect as we do our policy advocacy is which type of sustainable development of technology should we build for Latin America, considering our history, considering the types of technologies and the connection that feminist movements have with building infrastructures and technology that makes sense for a region, I guess. So this is all, I guess this is a big inspiration for building this feminist future that allows these types of initiatives to flourish and that incentivizes them to be used in schools, to be used in public services, and not the usual suspects, the very well-known usual suspects that are being used right now, and that in the end only replicates a logic of extracting knowledge and of extracting wealth from our region and transferring them to somewhere else. So we really believe this is very connected, and we celebrate a lot the FAIR initiative because it's allowing this to become more visible, and it allowed us to connect or reconnect even more with these groups and with these principles.
Thank you, Jamila. I think you are mentioning a lot about the ways technologies are built as part of your learnings. You mentioned that technologies should be territorialized and developed by and with the communities. But we have seen that this is not always easy because it changes, as you said, the framework in which usually technologies are developed. We are used to think that technologies need to be like developed super fast, at scale, with certain characteristics, but by certain groups of people. But with your research and also with experience of the teams that are developing their technologies as part of the project, we're witnessing that we can change that way to understand technologies. What are for your from your experience, what considerations should we take into account when working in developing technologies that are localized, territorialized, and with and for communities?
Let me try to structure it in a way. Technology, first of all, technology will not solve historical structural problems, as you said in the beginning. And we have, first of all, to acknowledge historical inequalities that affect our societies and that are embedded in our societies. We cannot take a passive approach to how our technologies will influence or how certain practices will change, because that's precisely the opposite of what we are trying to do. There's no magical solutions. We need to connect and we need to collaborate and not trust an external agents that will solve that for us. I guess it's very beautiful also to see how the initiatives that we are seeing in the region are prioritizing giving people more autonomy. They are prioritizing allowing people to connect, because that's the type of logics that is being increasingly extracted from our communities for different forms and different factors, but also through technology. We see social media, we see different types of systems prioritizing polarization or facilitating polarization rather than dialogue and connection. So I guess it's very significant that feminist groups are thinking of technology for autonomy and for agency and for freedom of association, while we see an advance of mechanisms to prevent them to freely associate, because that's the most dangerous thing that could happen for authoritarian regimes or even for oppressive systems in general. And I believe one thing I would highlight, if we want to build technologies that are really territorialized, contextualized, etc., one key thing has to do with how do you build these collaboration mechanisms. And it's very interesting to see the types of strategies that the teams developed. For instance, having workshops with the groups to inform them on different types of elements, including to share them, their principles, their feminist principles. And as I said, learning from them on their own principles, because it cannot be one side. And again, this is the type of thing that will be very difficult to implement in a massive scale AI that will connect everything to everything and will decide on everything for us. But maybe that's not the type of AI that we are looking for in this particular region. And that's one provocation I would like to leave you with also, because it's easy to say, well, that's not feasible within a form of tech operation that has its times, has its funding, has its etc., 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 etc. Okay, so maybe these technologies will have their very particular place, and we will try to limit the forms and the types of abuses that they can generate. And here we will try to prioritize technology that allows knowledge exchanging, for instance, and that needs more time to be developed, and that needs the possibility to not be developed. which is a very interesting thing that came out of this conversation. And it's also a question we are always asking ourselves as Derechos Digitales when we think of the right to participate in decisions around implementing or not AI into certain contexts, which we defend strongly in different types of projects and different types. And we deeply believe that these technologies, as extractivists, as other types of technologies, should be subject to prior consultations in several contexts. But what happens with the right to say no, as a colleague mentioned at some point, people need to have the right to say no. We don't want this to be implemented. Is that, how do we make that possible? I guess is a question under the types of logics that we are subject to. Let's fix this, let's fix that, even understanding that this has not necessarily been the case in other fields, for instance, the environmental field that we could use as example and space for learning. So there is an open question on how people will be able to say no to certain types of big projects, technological projects, infrastructure projects. But at the same time, when we do our community community-led projects, our feminist initiatives, we have to put that into consideration, and maybe being able and being flexible to build this type of relationship will be valuable to reach other forms of solutions that don't depend on AI precisely. And that's something that we highlighted a lot in the two documents that we said, because that's about escaping this narrative of tech solutionism in a sense, right? So I guess this is one criteria to be taken into account, and I would really value initiatives like FAIR and other funding initiatives that could take this into consideration and not necessarily say, I will fund for this result to be achieved, but I want to fund this idea to be developed, to be experimented, to be tested, to be piloted. And I want to fund this to flourish, and understand that not reaching certain tech result or certain system, it's not the failure of a process. It can be the most successful results of a process that is territorialized, contextualized, grounded, etc. And it is a learning process for all parties, because I guess we also have to think that and to acknowledge that not all ideas are good, and that's not why that's not reason why they shouldn't be tested or they shouldn't be incentivized, or we shouldn't think of ways to allow people that have not had the chance to test their ideas historically, especially in the tech sector, to test them. So how do we balance that? I guess it's a very interesting conversation, and we could reach different forms of even incentives for that to flourish. And I guess it would be a very fruitful exercise. And the other things I guess have to be in place is the protections, escape the extractivism aspect, and try to build safeguards that allow these initiatives to advance. I guess one key thing, and I'm not a technician, and I would love to hear more from you on that, has to do with how do we build our systems from tools that are ethical for us, from tools, if we depend on a different set of tools that we will assemble, that we will make connect, and that were trained under certain conditions, and that it were developed under certain conditions and for certain purposes, how do we attest that they are aligned with the purposes of our project? And that's also a policy question. And again, to continue making this connection on how do we make these systems be accountable for everybody who wants to use them, that they followed certain basic criteria when they were developed, so that we can use them for our projects, and we know that we are using something that is aligned with us. And the conversation in Virginia Brusa, that led one of the projects, was very insistent on that, about how do we also share the types of pieces of code and the databases that we build considering these principles and these processes. And then the other side of that, how do we make sure that by sharing it, we are also respecting decisions from the community? I guess that are very interesting. This itself could be a very interesting way to continue thinking of principles, of practices, of how do we put different communities into conversation, open data, open software communities, and these feminist groups that are developing this to think about which type of criteria, which type of protection, how to do that. But we definitely agree that having more of these systems open and available for others to use will be key also to advance these initiatives as far as they respect all the rights and the processes in the middle.
Thank you, Jamila. There's one comment, I would like to read it out loud. It's from Daniela Horta. Lovely presentation and initiative. Thank you so much, everyone. Just as a thought, this conversation makes me think about policy sustainability and companies in the tech industry. As you have talked about today, big techs are focused within the generation of profit, often leaving behind intersectional and feminist mechanisms. If we add the colonizing perspectives, it may be harder even. We need to find or create and promote practices that affect all levels, local and structural, with all accountable stakeholders. Super interesting and complex topics. I don't know if you would like to react to that comment.
Yes, definitely. I guess, and that's why I believe this is a lot of pieces that we have to take into account. And as I said in the beginning, for us, it was very valuable to develop this type of work and be informed by this type of practices, because we will sit at the IGF, or the Internet Governance Forum, which I don't know if all of you know, but you would be very welcome to also occupy this space, which is a space to discuss internet governance, but it's also being used to discuss AI governance, and it's also being used by the same old known actors, and it is an open space. So we will sit there and we will be able to share that in Latin America or in the global South, women are developing technology with this emphasis, and that we need to think about this in different layers and with different considerations of these groups also. Then that maybe these groups need different types of incentives, different type of governance, different types of regulation, or maybe these groups are inspiring us in thinking about regulation that can push other actors into being more accountable, into being more transparent, into being more respectful also. I guess this doesn't end in itself. I guess for us, a big piece of the main piece of what we do is how do we incorporate human rights perspective into discussions on technology, which are not always taken into consideration, and usually not taken into the consideration. And sometimes they are being questioned because of a push for development, because of a push for inclusion, because of a push for we need to create jobs for people, we need to generate wealth for our countries, and this is the way to go. And what we are putting into discussion, or what we want to put into discussion, is what type of development, what type of employment. One of the amazing projects that we followed in this past fair cohort had to do precisely with crowd workers, with the works that are with the invisible woman workers that are training AI from Latin America in very precarious conditions, that are by design being prevented from connecting one to another. And this beautiful project wanted to facilitate mechanisms to empower them. using technology. So these are conversations that are not visible yet. These are conversations that are not taking place yet. When someone comes with the development card, we need to be able to question that development card and say, you know what, we have an alternative idea for development that is grounded in human rights, that is grounded on principles of justice and of equality, that is grounded in feminism, and that is more it's more contextualized to what we need in our region. Maybe other regions need something else, but what we are seeing, our key priority for us has to do with overcoming historical inequalities, and that will not come, as I said, as magic from technology. That will come from changes in practices and changes in legislation and changes in how do we build collaboration and the possibility to have agency in how we want to build our future. And the type of technology and the type of development that is often being discussed in these spaces is not really aligned to that particular need.
Thank you very much, Jamila. I think, I think that the work that you are doing and how you are highlighting what's been done in Latin America, and of course the work that all the teams are doing, it's very inspirational in a sense, because I think we are trying to prove that it's possible. As you said, it's possible to find alternatives for technology. It's possible to highlight the work that women are doing and the work that is necessary for developing AI. And it's also highlighting that not only, for example, academics or technologists are those who can build technologies, and also the methodologies that can be implemented, taking into account, as you said, historical legacies and also cultural differences. You mentioned now that this is how are we working here in Latin America, but probably in other regions might be different. And one thing that we learned from our project, for example, is that, for example, in Latin America, of course, feminist movements have permeated public debate, but this is not the case in other regions. And when we speak about feminist AI, it can be a limitation. For example, if we take this framework to other regions, because this framework is negatively perceived as a threat in other contexts. So, for example, feminist, the word itself doesn't have a translation in other languages, for example. And it's also part of the discussion, right? We use a framework, but this framework may be applicable to us, but not to others. Have you experienced something like that in your discussions around the world and a global debate?
I guess we can say that the word feminist is also under threat in our own region, and people are being threatened and harassed, including in these systems online, for being feminists, and that's something that we have seen increasingly here. We have not. I don't have like a specific experience to tell a situation in which a feminist framework was directly denied in our experience until now. But I believe we need to be strategic. We need to be strategic and be able to communicate beyond these types of restrictions or injustices, because as I say, even in our region, saying we are advancing a feminist framework, or going to some policy discussion and saying this is our feminist proposal, for you might be an element to close the conversation. And we are seeing trans women deputies being harassed, being threatened in our Congress every day. So this is not an easy an easy conversation. I guess what we try to do is to be very strategic on what are we trying to achieve and what are we trying to advance, and also being very transparent about that. We are talking about rights, we are talking about justice, we are talking about equity, we are talking about overcoming historical inequalities, and we will continue to talk about that no matter in which context, no matter under which words or which frameworks and which conditions. And that itself, it's also difficult. Speaking the language of human rights, although I don't have the example of a feminist, but even speaking the language of human rights can be very challenging in different contexts in which we participate. We have seen strong reactions from state actors in different spaces to the rights framework, and you can and that is a framework to which countries have agreed upon. So how come you cannot, even that framework is not accepted? We have seen it's very challenging to be in multi-stakeholder spaces, for instance, in which some actors are willing to participate only to market their businesses, or some other actors are willing to participate only to speak, and when you start to speak, they leave the room, and we have seen that happening several times. I guess we have a collective challenge, as I say, to occupy those spaces, to challenge those spaces and those forms of building, and also to try to build, if we really want to advance this type of conversation. And I understand not all collectives, not all organizations, not all groups want to put efforts into that. Direitos Digitales has a strong commitment to advancing human rights frameworks into different debates and conversations. We have a strong commitment to advance multi-stakeholder conversations, collaborations that can go beyond just one sector, but can include people from companies, people from states, together to build together responses to the problems that we have. But we do believe that some of these spaces and mechanisms are already I don't know how would I say it in English, but they are already taken, or they are already captured, and we really need to dispute them, and we really need to build other forms of taking those conversations to advancing those conversations. And that this is something that we see every day, and part of our work is to try to build other, and even try to identify other actors that can come into conversations, actors that wants to come into conversation. And these groups that are even sometimes they are structured as a private entity should come into conversation from the private sector and represent them, and represent the types of ideas that they want to advance, even being a for-profit organization, for instance, or policymakers from small municipalities that are developing alternative forms of organization in their communities, and they should come into conversation also, and not only go to the same actors that already have their views, and they already have their positions, and are not there necessarily to dialogue, but to just market their own perspectives. But yes, I guess I don't know how you are facing it from the project. I guess keeping this feminist approach and even taking it to this context might be very important for putting that into conversation. But as we said in the beginning, this is not only about technology, it's not only about one project. We're talking about several forms of inequalities that maybe we would just put into tension as we start this conversation, and maybe they need to be put into tension from different perspectives.
Thank you very much, Jamila, for pointing out the challenges that we are facing. Also in Latin America, of course. There's a question from Belen Roca. How do we make this goal of tech and infrastructure building attractive for funding? I think that even if we are talking from Latin America, offering a fresh and collective perspective, donors aren't that interested in AI system that couldn't be monetized. And since we don't want that kind of exploitation, I think that we need a key concept to relevate the idea of a tech grounded in justice and equality. Governments in the region are keen to announce initiatives in favor of gender justice, for example, but this doesn't reflect in practice. A previous step, I think, is to create mechanisms for hold them accountable for their words and proposals. But I would like to hear what you think about this issue.
Of course. Hi, Belén. Belén, also from Derechos Digitales team, and also contributed a lot to this initiative. I guess I agree, and but I will change a bit the answer, because I completely agree with the need to make governments accountable for the decisions they are making in terms of technology and in terms of funding. Not only governments, but even companies accountable for the decisions they make in terms of how do they include a gender perspective into their businesses, and a lot has to be discussed on that. But I would change a bit to say that I guess one first step to make donors interested in supporting this type of initiatives is to make these initiatives visible. And I guess this particular FAIR project has been very effective on that, and very effective on showing that there are a lot of ideas and a lot of people wanting to advance ideas without access to funds for them to be advanced. And I guess this is key. This is a key step if we want to change the way technology and even the technology industry considers gender aspects or gender equality aspects or justice aspects. Because otherwise we are trapped into these logics that says that technology is has to be massive, has to be big data, has to extract a lot of information of people, they don't have the time to connect with communities, they don't have the time to include participation or meaningful participation into their processes, and we basically don't know that there are other forms of building it, and there are other priorities that people put into technology. We had some interesting conversations some weeks ago with several leaders in terms of gender equality in Latin America, and it was very interesting to hear as we ask, what do you think is urgent for AI to consider gender equality elements? And the answer was what is urgent is that AI solves the problems of communities that were not solved and that were not seen. Because today AI is being used by governments basically to do something that I would summarize as prevent fraud. Prevent fraud that comes from the most vulnerable populations, not to prevent corruption that comes from states. Then it's also widespread in our regions. What they are trying to do is to control how the most vulnerable groups will have access to basic rights, such as the right to social welfare. They are basically trying to automate how you apply to that and to give into a system how to the decision into if someone is eligible or not to having access to less than $100 to buy basic food and to come out of the line of extreme poverty. That's what the investments in AI, in automated system, etc., they are going into that. They're not going into how do we prevent police violence in vulnerable communities. And what these activists are saying is, if we want AI to be more equal and just AI, the priorities of AI should be shifted into solving real problems of real people and problems that we see in our region. So I guess making this visible, and I guess the fact that these projects are pushing for autonomy and agency, it's not something less important than requiring accountability, which is something that we also do from these other actors, right? Accountability and respect for human rights. So I guess that's why it's really important to challenge these imaginaries. It's really important to challenge these narratives that are saying technology is what it is and it serves this particular. And when you have several people that are not developing technology, that no one ever allowed them to develop technology, but they do have ideas they want to develop based on technology. So I would answer it like that, but I guess it's very interesting conversation to continue having.
Thank you very much, Jamila. I think you mentioned one of the terms that is a part of the narratives, and it's the problem of scale. At the beginning of the project, we also faced that problem, and we decided with the learning from the teams that we didn't really need to scale things if the technology was going to serve the communities themselves. So I think part of the narratives are trying to reinforce this idea that technologies need to be developed for all, right? And that's part of the structural problems of technologies. If you think that you will have one technology that is good for all, then you probably will miss the particularities of communities. And you also mentioned another topic that is really important for our region is the problem of how these big technologies and universal technologies are used in our region, and particularly to control and surveil the poor and racialized bodies and people that are considered a threat to the system. So I think that you are pointing out all the considerations that we need to take into account when we speak about AI for and by communities and for our region. Considering also the labor that we are witnessing, that we are participating as women, and we are participating in the building of AI, but we are not visible because, of course, the work that we are doing is not considered valuable. For example, as you mentioned, the case of the crowd workers in labeling data, for example. So I would say that just to try to wrap up a little bit, that you are highlighting that we need to defend the right to experiment, the right to say no, the right to make things differently, the right to escape techno-solutionism, the right to make visible our labor, and also to defend alternative technologies grounded in feminism, justice, contextualized, territorialized, technologies that foster collaboration, agency, autonomy, and of course, the cultural differences of our region. Just to close very briefly, what are your thoughts of the future, of moving forward?
I guess we have a lot of opportunities moving forward. We would be very happy to keep this conversation going and to advance that together with different types of donors, for instance, to make this even more viable, even more significant for our region and for other regions. And we will also continue this work of documenting how technology is being used in Latin America. Derechos Digitales will continue this project that I mentioned at the beginning called ia.derechosdigitales.org, which is called AI and Inclusion, because precisely we want to dispute this idea of inclusion, dispute this idea of development, and we will be happy to continue exchanging. We want to continue putting ourselves at service of documenting these initiatives, and also to try to build dialogues between communities that are not necessarily dialoguing. I guess this conversation about scale is very key conversation. I guess there are different forms of approaching scale, for instance. We can think of it as one system governs all, but we can also think of how systems collaborate, how systems integrate, how systems dialogue, and all the conversations around free, open, interoperable software that are maybe not so present today in conversations around AI should be brought into this also. So I guess from Derechos Digitales, this is our commitment to continue to put ourselves at service of all these communities, being a platform for documenting their experiences, making bridges, and also facilitating dialogue. We would be happy to continue doing that, and also to report the abuses that we know are happening, and to push our governments, our decision makings into better policy making, into more just practices, and taking the learnings that we have from all this into these spaces. I guess for us, that's the future. That's the future that we need, because otherwise things will be very complicated.
Thank you very much, Jamila. I will pass the mic to Caitlin, but before I will read a couple of comments. It's from Jimena Cuscano. It's very true. Escalating this type of problem to the directives, mainly men or people who are not feminist conscious, is very difficult. That's why regulation is still in an endless debate, and things like unregulated deepfake happen. Currently, deepfake pornography is a freely accessible and increasingly popular avenue of violence toward women. And Sophia, thank you for the fascinating webinar. Is the recording going to be shared with us? Yes, absolutely.